We are three-dimensional beings, and we perceive our world as being dimensional and having perspective, and we can change our perspective, and the perspective towards the objects is changing. It becomes bigger when you get closer, it becomes smaller when you go further away. And that's hard to do with simulations. I mean, it comes from all kinds of directions. I mean, there's more immersive projections or the glasses or things like that. But I still think people appreciate if something is in their physical space. It's not a simulation. It's kind of real. You know, it looks like you can touch it, or you can actually touch it. And if something moves, it triggers our basic senses. You know, something that moves somewhere in the corner, you immediately look, even though you might know it's not interesting, or you can't help it. You know, like you get attracted to this. So it's movement, light, and the music also, in the combination, that kind of are our basic organic triggers. And if you work them right, you can create a deeper level of emotional connection. And that's what I'm trying to do. We are very abstract. I'm using just technology, but people still say they had an emotional response to it. And yeah, this is my goal, to stay real, use technology, but still try to create an emotional response. Kraftwerk is kind of the original inspirational place where I first had the idea to do installations in such a scale and in such an environment. I always loved to come to the Atonal Festival here in Kraftwerk, but I always thought it's a pity that there's just a screen on the end, or sometimes screens on the side, and there's a bit of moving lights, but that's it. And I always thought this huge airspace, there should be something in it. And that's where I had the idea for Deep Web many, many years ago, 8, 9 or 10 years ago. And yeah, since then, whenever I imagine a larger scale installation, I immediately think of Kraftwerk as a backdrop, because yeah, Kraftwerk is not a neutral space. I don't like white cubes or black cubes or neutral spaces. I like Kraftwerk because of the texture it has, the character it has, and yeah, I kind of feel at home here, and I love the place. So I was super happy that they allowed me once more to come back. I mean, Kraftwerk by itself has a certain kind of structure and texture. It's made like a cathedral. It has a central element, and then it has two side ships, and it has the columns and so on. So this time I brought my own canvas. So I have two long, very long black textile walls hanging on two sides of along the columns to kind of give a bit of a neutral backdrop, and also a kind of surface for the lasers to draw on. Because if you just draw with the lasers into the Kraftwerk, it gets kind of messy because the structure is unclear. And so this time I used two canvases to kind of frame the laser work on a certain layer in the space. And yeah, it's lasers again, but completely different. And this time I'm moving all the lasers. So I have 50 lasers. They're moving in space, and I'm not drawing lines. I'm drawing more complex figures and textures and graphics. And I can do two things. I can use them three-dimensional in space to kind of make a solid shape out of light, and I can use them to draw animations like 2D patterns onto the side walls. So I have a lot of variety. And also the Vector show is a bit of a sum up of all the other shows, you know, so there might be elements that I have used in other shows already. And yeah, Kraftwerk is the perfect backdrop to come back once more. And the scale also of this work is like almost 3 times the size of the other works I did here before. So this time I'm making use of the whole Kraftwerk, 100 meters long, 60 meters wide, 25 meters high. It's an enormous indoor volume, and I'm completely filling it with the laser installation. Laser is an old technology, nevertheless everybody connects it with future. Like whenever you see a future movie, the guns or whatever they have, or the navigation system or scanning system or whatever they have is laser. Because it's still our most futuristic light. I mean, there can be LED developments and all that stuff afterwards, but the quality of the laser light, the way it looks like really made by aliens. I still cannot believe that humans came up with this idea, and also how the drawing of the laser beam works, that it moves so fast that we can just not see it, that it's only one one line of laser actually moving so fast that you can draw surfaces and shapes and so on. So for me, the fascination of laser is unbroken. But of course, I wanted to get away from the traditional way how to use lasers. I mean, the only thing that changed since the 80s, in my perspective, is everybody's using more lasers. So in the 80s, you could afford 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or I don't know, and now you have 50, 100 lasers, whatever. But they're still mostly on one plane, pointing towards the audience. Of course, that's the strongest appearance. And all patterns kind of look still like, yeah, like triangle or square or line, you know, like very simple. And they're all synchronized, mostly doing the same thing, repetitive. So bigger and more is better. That's kind of the credo of the time at the moment, which is also due to the control softwares that are used, which I find very limiting because they still think in 2D planes, like you draw 2D graphics and then you basically extrude them into space. That's the thinking. We completely turn it around. We draw all the patterns in 3D first. So we can draw a 3D object or volume in space, and then we calculate it backwards into the 2D plane or the 2D graphic that controls the laser. So we are totally turning this upside down. So we come from 3D space because the laser is extending in 3D space and leaving a shape like a pyramid or a tube or much more complex shapes. And by doing that, we can also synchronize all the lasers. So we have all the lasers moving on winches. I call it kind of laser pods. So each pod is 5 lasers, 4 to the side, 1 down. We can move them up and down by about 10 meters here with 1 meter per second speed. And we can do that all synchronized. So even moving them on full speed, we can still draw a connected image because we know where they are in 3D space and we are calculating everything in 3D. So it means all the lasers moving can still draw one connected line all around the perimeter or much more complex shapes. And that gives like an explosion of possibilities. The moment you break away from the 2D graphic logic of the laser control, you have so many options and possibilities that it's even hard to imagine what you can do. And yeah, what we're showing here is just the start of it, I think. We just started working with this new way how to control it and come up with patterns that work that way. I am always saying it took me 5 years to realize this installation, but that's also mainly due to we needed to develop the winches to do it. And our signature for the motor winches that we're using is that the power and the signal is in the lifting cable. So we do not have extra lifting wires or anything. So the cables are actually the lifting wires. It's a very elegant way how to do this. But it's also very complex and complicated, and we need to move them at very high speeds, at very high precision, and then also need to be synchronizable. You could do eventually something similar with chain hoists, but you wouldn't have the stability and the speed and the precision of it. And yeah, at the same time, we're transferring, I think, 2 times 1000 watts plus 2 times gigabit Ethernet down the winches while we can move them with 1 meter per second. And it was important to build this platform. I call it a platform winch. All the winches we built before, they're connected to certain light objects or LED bars or spheres or stuff like that. This one is a platform. You basically have a hanging a tube at the end, a bar, and you can hang on it whatever you want, moving lights or the lasers in this case, or a screen or whatever you want. And yeah, it took us more than 5 years to develop this platform, to get everything stable, to get it smooth, to get it calibrated. And this is the basis to do something like that. Yeah, I think I was one of the first, or maybe even the first one, to do what's today known as kinetic lighting. You know, I used a bigger array of light elements. I moved them with winches. There were winch and motor systems and automation, of course, for a long time, but no one did it in such a high resolution, precise and synchronized way by computer software. And yeah, since then, 20 years have passed almost, and of course it inspired a lot of others, and I'm really proud of that. For me, it's very interesting because I grew kind of a market in the event industry. You know, today many shows have these elements, and it's even getting scaled up and inspires a lot of other developments, and people also thinking it further. That's what I really like about this process. You know, I came up with things to a certain degree, but people pick it up there. For them, that's the starting point, and then they're even pushing that further and enhancing it and so on. So it's also interesting, challenging and terrifying at the same time, you know. And it's the only problem I actually have a little bit with it is the crediting process. You know, if I print a picture of someone, I always put their name on it. But with creative environments or with light shows or with visuals or things like that, it's not like that, you know. It's like free to take, and this is maybe the only critique point I have about it. If you're inspired by someone or something, just name it. Apart from that, I'm very excited to be in this environment and continue to contribute. And of course, I try to push it as far as I can. I think with this show, I pushed it quite hard, or we all together pushed it hard. It's a real big team effort, but also push event industry and thinking and how softwares are done and how control is made to another level, because I think everything should be in one kind of 3D environment, because it all lives in the physical 3D environment. And I'm pushing really hard for that, and I think shows like that help to inspire other people to think more in this direction. The lasers are small, I think 5-watt lasers from Quant called Berry-Light. And the good thing about them is like the way you can mount them. So they have a lot of mounting points where they're not, you don't need to hang them or like mount them from below or on top like usually, but you have a lot of other mounting points, and that allowed us to create our own, I call them laser pods. So we built this kind of housings where the lasers attach to, and then we have kind of the distribution of the e-stop and like all the other systems running through our the Winch XL, the Kinetic Lights Winch XL, and it's a very good match between these two systems from the weight characteristics, how much power they use, and the data. I always like to have some additional lighting. I have a lot of powers in the space, more than 250 I think, to give the Kraftwerk itself a face. So parts of the show are just illuminating the Kraftwerk, the space itself. So I'm partly playing the space itself. I have a couple of moving lights in the center to kind of give an additional like contrast to the laser. The laser is this very sharp, bright beam, and I use the moving lights to make more an atmospheric, like more broader, wider kind of coloration of background, for example, to give a nice contrast between the lasers and the surrounding light, to work with complementary colors and so on. For my very first kinetic installation, Atom, I created it more than 20 years ago now. It was always important for me that it's connected to sound, to music. I mean, not only music, but it can also be sound design, like cineastic soundscapes, things like that. And I always worked with higher level composers and musicians in that field, like Robert Henke, one of the founders of Ableton Live, or Cunning Ray, or others. And it's very interesting on one hand because you get inspiration also from their music, but on the other hand, of course, it limits my control, and the music might sometimes be in a direction where I would like to go in another direction, or I cannot directly influence or change it. And that was very interesting for me for a long time, but this time I was thinking it would be nice to think everything really together at the same time. So the sound and the visuals and everything kind of comes from one place, and I can compose it at the same time and think it together. And I think that enhances the possible impact, because it's not so much one is illustrating the others, but they're kind of forming a unity right from the beginning. And then, of course, I was always interested in immersive sound systems, in 3D sound systems, because everything I do with the light, or in this case with the lasers, is 3D. It's in space. It's positioned somewhere. So for me, this time it was important that I can do the same thing with the sound. So that's why I choose a 3D 30-channel sound system from L-Acoustics with the ELISA system, because it allows me to treat the sound in the same way that I normally program and treat the light. And I can work with it in 3D, first in a simulation and then in the reality. And yeah, that proved to be really powerful, extremely interesting to me, but also extremely challenging because I'm not a trained musician. The big challenge is to pre-produce this kind of soundscape that here we have it distributed over almost 80 meters by 25 by 25 meters, something like that. So the distance between two speaker sections is 12 meters. And the distance in the studio where we built a small version of it, also with the full 30 speakers, so we had speakers everywhere on the ceiling, 3 layers on the sides and so on. The distance is 1 meter. So of course, if I'm sitting in the center of that, I can still clearly hear the sound from the loudspeaker in the back. But in reality, if you're in Kraftwerk, the time it needs to travel for the sound to arrive at your ear, and also the distance, of course, make it appear completely differently. So it is possible to kind of pre-program it in the studio, but then you need to adapt it again in Kraftwerk. So we spend a lot of nights readapting everything to the actual space. The reverb, for example, in the studio, you tend to add a lot of reverb because it sounds bigger and powerful. And here in reality, it adds the real reverb of almost 14 seconds here in Kraftwerk. So that's also an interesting factor that you have to take into account. And yeah, it was a really interesting challenge to scale up and still have a clear sound in such a very difficult environment here. Yeah, the sound is totally moving or even jumping or like appearing on random positions depending on what laser patterns we are producing. So that's, for example, we're turning on kind of a laser scanners going down one after the other, and the sound exactly moves in the kind of same steps through the space. We have things that are panning, so if the lasers are kind of panning around, then the soundscape will also move. We work with up and down, or sometimes we're compressing the sound. It comes from the bottom up to a small point on top, and then we're kind of redistributing it around. There's many possibilities how we can distribute it. And there's not one scene is the same like the other, so we do it very individually per scene. Okay, how should the sounds that we have available be spatialized according to what the visuals are doing? I really need to state, and it's very important, that yes, my name is there as the artist and as the originator, but I'm like merely a director. You can compare it with a movie. You know, when you have a movie director, there's hundreds of people working on that movie, adding their own art, adding their own knowledge to make it a success. And I have a very big team. 52 permanent people at the moment, plus, I don't know, 20, 30 freelancers worked on this show and are still working on it. We're developing the technology, we have engineers, we have software developers, we have creative people working with me on the show. It's a huge team effort. This is something you cannot do alone. You need a very committed and savvy team that has grown up with these things and knows what they're doing and helping build something that none of them has built before, including myself. So it's always a big challenge to get something like this done, because none of us knows how to do it, and still we managed to do it all together in the end. And then also big support from L Acoustics, helping planning the system, getting the processor, getting support and how to set up such a system. I work with MDG, the hazers, the best haze in the world, to get a really good haze in the space but not fog it up, you know, because the space is so big. If I put too thick or too much haze in it, it's nice for the laser, but you only see the first 4 lasers because all the rest disappears in the thickness of the haze. So it's also very important to have really good quality of haze there. Roby supported me again with the moving lights. Yeah, so there's a lot of support from all sides to make all this happen.